All right, so we left off with the brain. First thing we said about the brain is that it is the seat of the human mind. Okay? It's the physical structure that controls the body and houses the mind. So I want to finish talking about the physical brain, and then we'll talk about mental disorders. The three main structures are the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. And we ended class with the two protective structures, the cranium, as well as the other bones of the skull, and the meninges. The meninges is the triple layer membrane that protects the brain internally inside the skull. It secretes cerebral spinal fluid that cushions the brain. That cerebral spinal fluid circulates throughout your brain and the cavities inside the brain. Also circulates down your entire spinal column where your spinal cord is. Then I want to talk about two types of nervous tissue in your nervous system, in your brain and spinal cord in particular. Nervous tissue. There are two types of tissue found in your brain, in your spinal cord, and the first is gray matter. Gray matter. This is synonymous with the functioning part of your brain. You've heard about gray matter, right? It's the functioning tissue of both the brain and the spinal cord, is referred to as gray matter. A couple things about gray matter. Gray matter actually appears grayish brown, which is why they just call it gray matter. It literally appears grayish brown due to the lack of insulating proteins and fats. It literally appears grayish brown due to the lack of insulation. The insulating protein is called myelin, but this part of the brain is not insulated because it's the functioning part. It contains the actual nerve cells called neurons. It contains the actual nerve cells called the neurons. So this is the functioning part of the brain. It initiates and receives impulses from your nerves. Then the gray matter is located on the outer layer of the brain. It's kind of counterintuitive. You think, oh, it should be in the center of the brain. We should protect it. Well, that's why we have the meninges, to protect it, because right below the meninges, directly attached to the third layer of the meninges, is the gray matter of the brain, the actual functioning part of the brain. Contains the actual nerve cells called neurons, and it's located on the outer layer of the brain. It's called the cortex. Anytime you have an organ in the body, the outer layer of the organ is called the cortex. The inner layer is called medulla. Even your kidney. Okay? You have your renal cortex and your renal medulla. In your brain, you have your cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer of the cerebrum. You have your cerebellar cortex, which is the outer layer of the cerebellum. The brainstem does not have a cortex because it's in the very interior of the brain itself. So gray matter is the actual functioning nervous tissue. It initiates and receives nerve impulses. This is where your thoughts would have to occur and be generated and so forth if we're trying to figure this out physically. It is the outer layer of the brain called the cortex. So the most important part of your brain is your cerebral cortex. It's the outer layer of your cerebrum. Okay? But with your spinal cord, which we're really not concerned with today, the gray matter is in the middle. as it goes down your spinal column. Then the other is white matter. So you have gray matter and white matter in your brain. The gray matter is the outer cortex, the actual functioning part. The white matter is the supporting and conducting tissues of the nervous system. The supporting and conducting tissues. So white matter appears white due to the insulation around the nerve fibers. It's kind of like an electrical cord, because the nerve fibers will transmit the nerve impulses, and they are insulated with that special myelin protein, and it appears milky white. So it is literally white matter. White matter, secondly, is made up of the nerve fibers connecting the neurons and making up the nerves. It is made up of the nerve fibers that connect the neurons and make up your nerves. Branch off of your spinal cord and go everywhere in your body. Branch off your brain directly to go everywhere in your head. Also, white matter contains support cells. They're called neural glial. And these nourish the brain, support the brain. There's even some immunocells in the brain that are white in the white matter. One particular type of neural glial cells are the astrocytes. Astro like a star. Cyte is the medical name for all cells. Astrocytes, those are supporting tissue. And the significance of the astrocytes is they will form scar tissue. Your brain has very little ability, once you are more than 5 years old, to regenerate nervous tissue. All you can do is generate scar tissue. You can't really regrow, that's not a good word, you can't really replace, not regrow, you can't really replace gray matter. Once the neurons die, you cannot do much cell division. They don't do much cell division at all. They will be replaced with scar tissue, these astrocytes. So you have gray matter and white matter. Yes?
Can you go over the third point again for white matter?
It's also made up of supporting cells. They're called neural glial. In your nervous system, you do have two cell kinds. You have neurons. These are the functioning nervous cells that generate and initiate nerve response. And then you have neural glial. This word literally means nerve glue. And this, of course, these are your actual neurons are your actual nerve cells. And is the astrocytes, which is the type of neuroglial cell. They look star-shaped. That's why they're called astrocytes. And they are one of the main types of cells that support your brain. And they also form scar tissue when the brain is damaged, because we won't replace those neurons. It's called neurogenesis, and there's very little neurogenesis going on once you become an adult. So nervous tissue. I like to tease the 7th graders or the 9th graders and tell them, I walk in here and there's gray matter splattered all over the back of the room because I covered a difficult concept. And that's literally the functioning tissue of the brain found in their cerebral cortex, if they have one. So we don't know about that. It's yet to be decided. All right, so with your brain is the physical structure that controls the body and houses the mind. Okay, and it's made up of 3 main parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Okay, and of course the part of the brain that's damaged is going to determine what happens. Fortunately, next we're going to talk about the cerebrum in detail. When we're talking about your brain, we're mostly talking about the cerebrum. Okay, and there's a couple of things I want you to know about the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the main part of the brain. The cerebral cortex is where your brain functions, the outer layer, okay? So first of all, the cerebrum is the main part of the brain. Its cortex, called the cerebral cortex, is where most of your brain functions occur, okay? And this would include your mind, okay? Because when the cerebral cortex is damaged, people have alteration of their behavior, their personality, and so forth, if you have enough damage to the cerebral cortex. So when we're talking about brain and brain damage, we're mostly referring to the cerebrum and its functioning layer, the cerebral cortex. Okay, so the exterior of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex. It's very highly convoluted. You've seen the brain. High school's doing dissections. I could bring a sheep brain in here. It's very small. Fits very easily in my hand. Sheep have a very small brain size to body ratio. Apparently that's why they're stupid. But anyway, so the exterior of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex. It's very highly convoluted. It has all these little ridges and depressions in it. Then the gray matter is exterior. It's in the cerebral cortex. That's where the functioning takes place. So we're talking about brain damage. We're talking about the mind. We're talking about the cerebral cortex. Would be the more exact location. Then the cerebrum, second point, is divided into two mirror image hemispheres, separated by a deep groove called the central fissure. That's F-I-S-S-U-R-E. So your cerebrum is divided into two mirror image hemispheres, separated by the central fissure, very deep groove. Those grooves are called sulci, plural, sulcus, and the little ridges are called gyri, if you want to know the medical names, but that's not important right now. The left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum tend to control different aspects of the brain's functions. The left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum tend to control different aspects of the brain. By studying brain damage and so forth and brain stimulation, scientists have kind of divided things into what main things are done by the right hemisphere, what main things are typically done by the left. But it varies a lot between individuals. Okay, and they are mirror images. Why do you think you have two essentially identical hemispheres of your brain? It's redundant, so that if you have damage, one area can be retrained to take over that lost function. So we have left and right hemispheres that tend to control different aspects of the brain. One hemisphere can be retrained to take over functions of the other hemisphere when damage occurs. That's why we have two mirror images. But that takes therapy. That part of the brain has to be retrained. Both physical therapy, speech therapy, and so forth. It's very common for someone with brain damage to have trouble with speech. And with therapy, they can recover a lot of that, but many times not all of it. Then, as far as the hemispheres go, one side typically dominates the other. You've heard the joke that left-handed people are the only ones in their right minds. That's because we have a tendency to cross over. So the right hemisphere of the brain, in most people, controls their left side, their left hand, their left part of their body, the motor skills, the movements of the left side. So then the left side of the brain tends to control the motor skills of the right side. So I guess you could say left-handed people are the only ones in their right minds because they are using their right hemisphere more than their left. But that's just generalities. Brain function is very difficult to understand. It's not well understood. Okay. Then the last thing with the cerebrum. The cerebrum, of course, is made up of its cortex, where all the gray matter is. The cerebrum is divided into two mirror image hemispheres. And lastly, the interior of the cerebrum is primarily white matter, where you have your supporting and nourishing tissues and the interconnection. The interior of the brain is white, and that's where you have all of your supporting and nourishing tissues, and you also have your interconnections. The cerebral cortex is where your nerve cells are, and they have to be connected to your spinal cord. So it's in the interior of the brain that these interconnections are located. There are also fluid-filled spaces called ventricles, where you will have the cerebral spinal fluid circulating. This, of course, has protective functions. It has nourishing functions. It also has a protective function as far as your immune system goes. So that is the cerebrum. Its cortex is where your brain is functioning, its outer layer. It's divided into those mirror image hemispheres. Those hemispheres are also divided into lobes. If you took high school biology, you learned them. You have your frontal lobes. That's where your intellect and a lot of your so-called higher mental processes take place. Behind that on the top is the parietal lobe. That's where you have a lot of your motor functions and your speech interpretation. On either side, you have the temporal lobes. You have two of each because they're mirror image hemispheres. The very back top is your occipital lobe, which is your vision and your visual interpretation. Then way below in the back is the cerebellum, but that's not part of the cerebrum. So the last thing one more thing with the brain, and that is areas controlled by the brain. On the quiz, we had areas controlled by the mind, your volition, your cognition, your emotions, your mood, your behavior, your personality. Now we have areas controlled by the brain. And guess what? Some of your mind functions are going to be overlapping with the brain. So where does the mind begin and the brain begin? You can't separate the two. The brain is the physical structure where the mind exists, but the mind is not physical. Okay? So areas controlled by the brain. First of all, physical body functions controlled by the brain. Physical functions of the brain. Physical functions of the brain include motor activity and coordination. That's muscle movement. It's referred to as motor. All of your motor skills, your muscle movement, and your muscle coordination, it's called motor activity and coordination, is controlled by the brain. All of your sensory interpretation is done by the brain. You have 5 senses: touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. All of those are interpreted in the brain. Also communication, both verbal, written. Your brain controls your ability to read and understand words. Your brain controls your ability to choose words, and these are kind of even in different locations. There are people who have had brain damage where they can think the word that they want to say, and they cannot coordinate their tongue and lips to say the word, so they have to have therapy. And so they have a big problem with their speech. And the same person may be able to actually write the words, but not be able to speak them. So there's all kinds of very complex interactions going on in the brain, spread throughout the different locations of the cerebrum. So we have motor activity and coordination, sensory interpretation, communication, both verbal, written, whether we're going to speak it or read it and write it. Also, your involuntary body functions are controlled by your brain. We mentioned the brainstem on Monday. The brainstem has a respiratory center that helps regulate your breathing. Your brainstem has a heart regulatory section. You also have communication with your endocrine system, which controls all of your glands. So a lot of your body functions are overseen by the brain. Okay? You have centers where your appetites are controlled, body temperature is controlled, all kinds of things, very complex and very difficult to say, okay, this does this, this does this, this does this. Then, secondly, mental areas controlled by the brain. We have physical control of the body, and we also have mental control of the body. Remember, the brain is the seat of the mind. So all of the areas controlled by the mind are centered in the brain. So what are those? Volition, cognition, behavior and personality, emotion and mood. And we know that because when the brain is damaged, the mental processes are affected as well as physical processes, both sections. So the body is literally the physical structure that controls the body and houses the mind. Last thing with the brain is damage to the brain, and this is where we're going to get into our mental disorders. Damage to the brain. Damage to the brain, first of all, results in a loss or alteration. If you have damage to the physical brain, you will have loss or alteration of skill, function, or a combination of both. You're going to lose function, or you're going to have altered function. So damage to the physical brain results in a loss or alteration of skills, functions of both the brain physically and the mind mentally. You're going to lose physical controls. You're going to lose mental controls. Loss and alteration of skills and functions of both the brain itself, the physical part of it, and the mental part of it. So underneath this, mind. How is the mind affected by brain damage? The mind can be affected by damage to the brain. Skills and functions of the mind can be lost or altered. First of all, you can have altered thinking. There are people with physical damage to their brain who have now altered thinking. Another, emotional instability. There are people with physical damage to their brain that has resulted in emotional instability. Also, uncontrolled behavior. And then the fourth effect on the mind is what's referred to as a coarsened personality. Their personality is altered. We refer to it as a coarsened personality. Less self-control is kind of what happens. And they will tend to be more blunt. They'll be more crude even, and so forth. They have a coarsened personality. Then the brain. Results on the physical brain. Brain damage many times can result in loss of motor skills or coordination. And this will require physical therapy. They may lose the use of one side. So they'll lose physical control of their right side, especially if they have a stroke or something, some other cerebral event in their left hemisphere. Okay, and they may never even regain control, proper use of that arm. So that would be motor skills and coordination. Communication skills. They may lose the ability to choose correct words. They may use the ability to speak the words they want to speak, even though they can, I guess, hear them in their mind. They can choose them in their mind and they can't speak them. They will also have trouble with communication both written and so on. Most of the time, brain damage does not result in lack of control of body functions. The brain does that quite well on both hemispheres. So when we have brain damage, the mind is affected, and of course the physical body is affected. Last thing here with damage to the brain, causes of brain damage. Causes of brain damage. The first is really not damage, but it does affect the structure of the brain. So the first is lack of development. Lack of physical development in the brain before birth or even after birth, because the brain is still developing and growing and so forth as a young child, especially a toddler. Another cause to brain damage is trauma. So the brain can be damaged by not developing correctly in the first place. It can be damaged by trauma, blow to the head, and so forth. It can also be damaged by infection, particularly meningitis. Another way it can be damaged is disease. By disease, I'm referring to a tumor, cancer, or some type of growth. Doesn't really have to be cancer. I'm also referring to vascular problems in their brain, problem with the circulation to their brain, having some type of seizure, okay, can damage the brain, or what's called a stroke. Stroke is when you have an interruption in blood flow for various reasons. The last is degeneration, and this of course is deterioration of the brain due to aging. Deterioration of the brain due to aging. So what happens when the brain is damaged? You're going to have loss and or alteration of skill and function of both the physical brain, referring to the body, and the mind will also be affected due to brain damage. So that brings us to mental disorders. Mental disorders, I call them mental disorders. Most of the time, if you look these things up, they will be called mental illness. So by way of introduction, I want to go through difficulties in defining and naming mental problems. We have difficulties both defining and naming mental problems. Of course, in the day and age that we live in our culture, it's not going to be politically correct to assign blame or take responsibility. So it's difficult to talk about mental problems, difficult to define them and even name them. I'm going to refer to them as mental disorders, because most of what we're talking about with a mental problem is a disorder. However, if you look these things up and study them from the standpoint of secular psychology, they will be called mental illness. I guess, do we need to do play on words again? Mental disease, mental illness, and a lot of them have it's very difficult to put your finger on the actual cause. We can't find a physical cause. So I think it's more appropriate to call them mental disorders, though they will be referred to in our culture and in our medical areas as mental illness. It's not proper to call it mental disorder. It's mental illness or mental disease, because that gives the connotation that it's physical and it's not that person's fault. Well, the purpose here is not to assign fault or blame, but to try to explain a little bit of a perspective on these things. So they are difficult to diagnose, they're difficult to identify and even decide what we're going to call them, okay? So we have difficulty in even identifying and naming them. Secondly, we have difficulty in diagnosing mental disorders. They're hard to identify and define. What are we going to call them? And they're hard to diagnose, because all we can do is try to describe symptoms. And the symptoms are not physical, they're mental. So it's very difficult. All right, another difficulty is it's difficult to identify cause. It's very difficult to put them in the area of medicine. Medicine deals with causes and effect. And it's both difficult to identify the cause and to even describe the effects. So it's a problem. Mental disorders are a problem. They're difficult to identify and even name. They're difficult to diagnose because the symptoms are mental. And they're difficult to identify their causes. Does that make sense? So what are we going to call them? How are we going to diagnose them? How are we going to treat them? Because we don't know the causes, all four. They're difficult to identify and name. Okay? They're difficult to diagnose because the symptoms are mental, not so much physical. They're difficult to identify the causes, and that makes them difficult to treat. There's not going to, and in our culture, we want to just throw medication at people. And that's simply not the answer. So there's difficulties. All right, now I'm going to try to give you a definition. All right, I'm going to read you a definition and then we're going to tweak it. Here's your typical definition from a medical type standpoint. That a mental disorder or disease, mental illness, is a disease of the brain that causes mild to severe disturbances in thought and or behavior, resulting in an inability to cope with life's ordinary demands and routines. I got that from the National Institute of Health. Okay? I disagree with some of it. I don't like the fact that they're calling it a disease of the brain. In my mind, a disease of the brain is Alzheimer's. In my mind, a disease of the brain is having a cardiovascular event and seizures. In my mind, a mental disease is epilepsy, okay? And things like that. So we're going to call mental problems, we're going to call them mental disorders, okay? So a mental disorder is a condition of the mind that may or may not be related to a disease of the brain. A mental disorder is a disorder of the mind that may or may not be related to a disease of the brain. And I do like the rest of their definition. It causes mild to severe disturbances. So a mental disorder, I'm not going to call it a disease, okay, is a disorder of the mind. Maybe it can be linked to a disease of the brain, maybe not. It causes mild to severe disturbance in thought, behavior, and or behavior. Mild to severe disturbances in thought and or behavior. That's why I'm not calling it a disease of the brain, because it causes mild to severe disturbances in thought and or behavior, resulting in an inability to cope with life's ordinary demands and routines. They're basically, we're talking being dysfunctional. All right, so I don't like the idea of a mental illness, but I understand why it's called that, and it is treated medically as much as possible. Okay, so last thing as far as introduction, we have difficulties, we have the definition, and now the scope of mental illness or disorders. Yes? Yes. Mental disorders are disorders or problems of the mind that may or may not be related to a disease of the brain. They cause mild to severe disturbances in thought and or behavior. Many times it's both thought and or behavior, resulting in an inability to cope with life's ordinary demands and routines. Scope of so-called mental illness in the United States. So-called mental illness. Over 200 identified forms of mental illnesses. There's over 200 identified forms of mental illness. You could spend a lifetime trying to study this. The most common mental illnesses, as they're called in our culture, are clinical depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorder, schizophrenia, and dementia. Clinical depression, bipolar disorder. Did I say that one? I don't remember saying it. Clinical depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety disorder, and dementia. Now, all of those I just mentioned, dementia has a physical cause, and I would call that an illness. Okay? Most time dementia is due to aging or deterioration of the brain. So we have the most common clinical depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety disorder, and dementia. These range in severity from mild to moderate to severe. They range in severity from mild to moderate to severe. And of course, how many of these have actually been diagnosed, how many of them are actual, is very difficult to decide. Last thing is, according to the NIH, around 60 million Americans have a mental illness. What is the population of the United States right now? 300 million? Okay, so this is a fifth, 20%. I don't know if this is high or not. This is difficult to put your finger on, 20 million Americans. But if we're calling some of this also includes ADHD, it includes ADD, it includes obsessive compulsive disorder, it includes panic disorders, there's all kinds of things. Okay, so that's the introduction. Causes of mental disorders. 2 causes. The first is physiological. Physio. This has the idea that we have a structural, cellular, or molecular basis involving the brain. If we have a physiological cause, we have a structural, cellular, or molecular basis involving the brain. Something's wrong with the structure of the brain, something's wrong with some of the cells of the brain, something's wrong with the chemistry or the molecules involved in brain chemistry. So these are abnormalities that involve the brain. We can find something abnormal in the brain. Something's abnormal in its structure, something's abnormal in the development, something's abnormal in the brain chemistry. These have a physical cause, so we call them physiological. Okay, so these physiological causes involve the 6 things we just mentioned. This involves damage to the brain. So this involves those 6 things that we just said. Developmental, due to a lack of proper development. Trauma, which is injury to the head. Disease. Infection. Degenerative. We also would add another one, congenital, which can be present at birth. So these have physical problems with the brain itself. Structural, cellular, or molecular. And these, of course, are what we just talked about with damage to the brain. Okay? Then we have psychological, different prefix. And this is where we're talking about our mental disorders. Psychological also have the idea of, rather than having a physical cause involving the brain itself, these are what's called, same prefix, psychogenic. Do you recognize the suffix? We had pathogenic in the first section, right? Disease causing. A pathogen causes disease. Well, we do have psychological mental disorders that have psychogenic causes. This literally means coming from the mind. So these are mental disorders that do not have a physical cause that we can find. No discernible physical cause, even though we look diligently for them. And you'll see statements like believed to be and so forth. But your psychogenic causes, that literally means comes from the mind rather than the brain, no discernible physical causes. So there's 2 things. This comes from the mind. So the first is there can be traumatic events that affects a person's mind. Traumatic events. Okay? PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So there are traumatic events that can affect a person's mind. Also, there are environmental causes. These are things that a person has exposed their mind to, whether they're drugs, whether they're incorrect thoughts, guilt, etc. Right? Then we have those 2 causes, physiological versus psychological. All right, and this is what has affected the mind directly. We're not finding a physical cause. Though if we do have a physical cause, it will affect the mind. All right, but it doesn't go both ways. Just because we have a mental disorder does not mean we have a physical problem. Then, so we've got introduction, 2 causes. Now, a third main point is 6 categories of mental illness. And I have that in quotes. 6 categories of mental illness that I'm going to say, I don't like the word illness. Let's use the word disorder. And they do use the word disorder when they're talking about them individually. The first one, anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders. These include panic attacks, called panic disorder. Includes PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Includes something else that they call GAD, G-A-D, generalized anxiety disorder. Social phobia, so phobias are involved here. Also called social anxiety disorder. And then OCD. A lot of people joke about OCD, but nobody that I know actually has it. Obsessive compulsive disorder. Those are anxiety disorders. Okay? Then we have mood disorders. So anxiety has the idea of irrational fear and worry and that type of thing. Mood disorders. Mood disorders. Of course, this involves mood. And of course, your main thing involved here is depression. So this includes clinical depression and bipolar disorder. Are two of the main ones in the mood disorders: clinical depression and bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder has the idea of extreme mood shifts, where a person is very irritable and even high in one sense, very agitated, and then they drop down to the other end where they're lethargic and so forth. That's called bipolar disorder. And again, we're talking mental, not physical. The next is psychotic disorders. These are the more severe psychotic disorders. These are disorders where you have distorted reality, and this is schizophrenia. Distorted reality can even involve severe delusion, social withdrawal, hearing voices. Okay, schizophrenia. It's called the psychotic disorder. Psychotic disorders. Then we have the next area is personality disorders. This, to me, is the one that is very much related to demonic influence, multiple personality disorders. Then we have behavioral disorders. Behavior disorders. Okay, these are ADHD, ADD. ADD stands for attention deficit disorder. ADHD adds hyperactivity. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. These are behavior disorders, and these definitely are not physical. Then we have eating disorders. And these can cause real problems for people. They do. Eating disorders involve anorexia nervosa, self-starvation. This is a big problem with your young girls, and it comes from, oops, sorry. Let's get this spelled right. A-N, no, that's right, A-O-R. I can't even spell it, because I don't think it's a illness. I think it's a nervous disorder. Anorexia. Nervosa. A-N-O-R-E-X-I-A, nervosa. Bulimia. That's your binge eating. Okay, those are eating disorders, and they are a problem. Okay, especially you've got your 13, 12-year-old girls, and their worldview, they're just all messed up mentally. Okay. Then we have, let me just give you a summary. There are two levels of severity, psychosis versus neurosis. Okay, a psychosis is very severe. This is your bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, multiple personality disorder. Very much distorted contact with reality and can be very dangerous. Neurosis is the milder level. These are non-psychotic. These are your anxiety disorders and your behavior disorders and your eating disorders. In summary, two things. Mental disorders are real, and due to our rejection of God in our lives and in our culture, they're becoming more and more of a problem. Okay? They're more of a, in medical circles and also in criminal cases. They're misidentified, they're misdiagnosed, and they're mistreated, but that doesn't mean they're not a problem and not real. Underlying cause, 3 of them. The fall of man is the ultimate cause. We have a sin nature, all right? And we have the fall also cursing us physically, disease and so forth. It makes sense that we're going to have problems with this. And then personal sin, guilt, personal rejection of God. What does Romans 1 say? Reprobate what? Mind is a direct result of sin. And then direct influence of Satan. So we have 3 underlying causes. The actual fall of man. Okay, we are in a corrupt world, in a sinful world. Personal sin, whether it's guilt, rejection of God in the Bible, or even the cruelty of others. There are victims of mental disorders. And then direct influence of Satan, especially the psychoses. Okay, we'll see you.